I've decided that there's something that's really just not fair at all, and that is that I have all the fun preparing for this class, and you guys only get to enjoy it for a little while on Sunday morning. That's just not right. But anyway, this worksheet, if you have the previous one, there's only one previous, you'll notice the first two questions are the last two on the first one. I thought instead of redoing that one, I'll just add those two questions that we hadn't covered to a new worksheet. And so here we are. We've got this, and we're going to look at the history and the accounting of history year-wise that God gives us. We've got 2 pages worth of it to check out this morning. At some point, you might think it gets a little tedious, but bear with me because I think you'll see why we are doing things this morning the way we are when we look at what's going on. Everybody got a worksheet that wants one? Okay. Chapter 10, what's an account of? Japheth's blank. What would you put after Japheth's and then that dash right there? I didn't leave a line, I just put a mark. All three are going to be the same answer. Japheth's genealogy. Look at chapter 10. By the way, what is a genealogy? A family history, your descendants. It's a line that goes back or goes forward depending on how you're looking at it. And so here we are in chapter 10. By the time we get to chapter 10, what major worldwide event has taken place? The flood. The flood has happened. It ends up, Noah and his sons get off, and so now we're getting the genealogies of Noah's boys. Chapter 10, verse 2, the sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog, Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshach and Tiras. It goes on from there. And then we drop down to verse 6. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. And then there's the sons of Bacon. You got Ham, you got to have Bacon. No, I don't see Bacon in there anywhere, but you do see Shem down at verse 21. Also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the older brother of Japheth. Children were to the older brother of Japheth. Children were born. So this is in brief, a genealogy of these 3 boys. By the way, look there at verse 21. To Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. Shem, his downline is where we will find the Israelites. And there is conjecture that this fellow Eber, this ancient ancestor of the Israelites, is the reason why they were called what? Hebrews. Where else would the name Hebrew come from? I don't know if you've ever wondered that or not, but I've wondered, where does that Hebrew? Jews, Israelites, but Hebrews, where does that come from? It's conjectured that this is the guy from which that word originates. If you know anything different or you find anything different, let me know. But at any rate, I just thought that I'd throw that in there. There's no extra charge for that. That's just a freebie because it is, to some degree, conjecture. Nobody knows for sure. When it started, nobody wrote down, this is why we started calling them Hebrews. That's just the way it is. But there's that. So number 8 of what is chapter 10 an account? Japheth's genealogy, Ham's genealogy, Shem's genealogy. Chapter 11, verse 10, look what we start here. These are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was the son of Noah, in whose lineage we will find Abraham. And of course, it's in Abraham's lineage that we find the children of Israel. So he is the one with whom we primarily continue. So there, number 9, the blanks are chapter 11, verses 10 to 32 is a continuation of Shem's genealogy leading to Abraham. Abraham's boys will be, who's the first one? Abraham's first boy. No, that's Noah. Abraham. Keep up, Larry, keep up. Ishmael, he's got it, yeah. His first son was Ishmael. Now, was that his son? It was his son. Who was his mama? Hagar. Not Hagar the horrible, Hagar the handmaid. Hagar, the handmaid, was Ishmael's mama. Who had God promised a son to? Abraham and Sarah. God's promises are specific. They're not just vague and general. He specifically promised a son to Abraham and Sarah. By the way, do you remember what Sarah did when she heard that promise? She laughed. What does Isaac's name mean? It means laughter. That's no accident either. So she laughed about that because she thought, there's no way. I'm so old I could never have another child. Shall I have pleasure again? Yes. Well, God fulfilled his promise, and they had Isaac. But first, it took 25 years for that to happen, and they got impatient, and they thought, maybe we need to help the Lord along. Is there a sermon there or not? Maybe we need to help the Lord along. No, we don't need to help the Lord along. If he said he's going to do something, he's going to do it. Now, ladies, I want you to take note, because I've seen this thing on Facebook where it says, ladies, if your wife says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. You don't have to remind him every 6 months. So see, this is the way God operates too. He gave them a promise. He didn't fulfill it for 25 years. In that 25 years, they got to thinking, you know what? It's not coming out the way we thought it would. Everything was going perfect according to God's plan, but it wasn't according to what they thought. So they come up with this plan. Actually, and I don't want to. Who's supposed to be the leader in the families? It's supposed to be the man. He's the one who's supposed to be the initiator. Now, that doesn't mean for an instant that he's not supposed to listen to his wife, because what's his wife there for? She is the helper by design, and sometimes what help the man needs is a suggestion from his wife. But he's got to make a decision about that suggestion, whether or not they should fulfill that or not. That doesn't mean, men, don't listen to your wives. It means, yes, listen to your wives. That's what it means. Listen to them. But you have to make a decision whether or not you're going to follow that decision. Abraham got this suggestion from Sarah. Here, take Hagar. What should Abraham have said at that point? No, that was not God's promise. God didn't promise me a son with somebody else. He promised us a son. Let's wait for God's promise. I'm not saying this to be critical of Abraham. I'm saying this because it's a lesson for me and for all of us, I think. That when God makes a promise, he's going to fulfill it. Don't start second guessing when it doesn't turn out the way you thought it would or the way I thought it would. Just wait. Just wait. Just wait. What did Peter say about God and time? He said, one day with the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. He lives outside of time. He's not concerned with time like we are concerned with time. He understands time, of course. He created it, and he will fulfill his promises in his own time. And it will be according to what he says, but it may not be according to what we think it's supposed to be. All right. Ishmael's the first boy. Isaac was the son of the promise. And what did God ask Abraham at one point to do with Isaac? Sacrifice him. That was the only son they had. The only son, and he was the son of the promise. They finally got him, and now that he's grown a little bit, God says, sacrifice him. And what does Abram do? He goes fully intent to sacrifice him. But why? The answer is found in Hebrews. Who knows what the Hebrew writer says about why Abraham was willing to do that? Yes, that's exactly right. Abraham was going to proceed with that because he had no doubt that God could raise his son Isaac from the dead. He could put him to death, no big deal. God gave him to me in the first place. He can raise him from the dead. That was Abram's thinking. That was his faith at that point. There's a sermon there as well. All right. Any questions about either of these first two? Let's get into the numbers. Based on the genealogies of chapters 5 and 11, how long was it from Adam until Abram's birth? I didn't put that question there so you could immediately answer it. I've got chapters 5 and chapter 11 kind of organized there according to what the scripture says about who had what when. So let's go to chapter 5. Look at verse 3. Genesis chapter 5, verse 3. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. That was Seth. Had Adam had any previous children? He certainly had. We know he had Cain and Abel. Those are the only two mentioned by name. But the implication is that there were many others. What did God tell Adam and Eve as soon as he created them in the garden? Be fruitful and multiply. And apparently that's exactly what they did, because by the time God sent Cain out with a mark on him, by the way, why was that mark on him? So no one would kill him. But who was there to kill him if Adam and Eve hadn't had previous children? So they had children. And by the time he has Seth, how old is he? 130. How many children could you have by the age 130? Especially if you start out no pain in childbirth, which is how Adam and Eve started out. Especially if you started out not worrying about the economy. Why do people say they can't have kids today or don't want to have kids? And I'm not criticizing anybody. Oh, it's just too expensive. We can't afford all those kids. Listen, one child takes all the money you've got. So 10 or 12 more aren't going to make any difference. Just forget it. You're not going to have any money if you have kids. But there's also a story that I remember. I never will forget it, and I hope I never do anyway. But this couple had one child, one little girl, and when she was 16, now this was told to me as a true story. When she was 16, I think it was, she was in an accident and she died. And all the time up until that, he was complaining about how much money she was costing. And then after she died, he said, man, I didn't realize she was absolutely priceless now that she's gone. So there's a perspective there as well. Anyway, that's kind of a sideline, but I hope it gives us some appreciation for what God gives us in our children and our grandchildren. Yes. Oh, Beck.
Hey, I just wanted to know, when it talks about the mark,
Yes.
what do you think that is? The kids were asking me that just the other day, and I was like, that's a good question. People knew not to kill him or not, but what was
Right.
that an ailment? Was that a scar?
I have no idea. I have no idea. Do you know what people used to say it was? People used to say, oh, that was the black skin. The black skin people are the descendants of Cain. But what takes that argument out of the way? Prior to the Tower of Babel, the flood. The flood. The mark was specific for Cain. I don't know that there's anything in Scripture that would ever lead us to believe that mark was to follow down on his descendants. It was for Cain. It wasn't black skin. At least if it was, that's not what the Scripture says. And people have come up with all kinds of crazy ideas about the Bible from things that the Scriptures say, and they don't. When God doesn't give you the details, don't fill them in for him. That's always a good rule of thumb. Just let him give you the details and then let it stop there. If you want to study about it and think about it, what could this possibly be? I do that all the time. That's how we do eventually discover some things, but when you don't discover a truth, don't come up with a goofy thing like black skin and say that's what the mark was. Good question, but I don't know. And it's of interest to me that God tells us things like that and then doesn't explain himself. What's that? Yes, we need another verse. At least we think we do. He doesn't. If he did, he'd have given it to us. What does the first verse of the Bible say? God did what? And then he immediately tells us all the details about how he did it, right? All it says is he spoke and things came in. There's no physical explanation. There's no explanation in our universe for how that takes place except faith in what God said he did. He spoke it into existence.
What if he went into as much detail about that as what he did and how to build the Ark of the Covenant?
How big would the Bible be? Yeah, that's a good question because I've wondered that. How many things could God give us more details about? But it's just like going to Walmart. What do you go in for most of the time? Oh, just one or two things. Yeah, and you come out with a buggy full because it's like, no, no, no. I'll pull up and let Debbie out. I'm just going to run in and get some hairspray. Okay. 3 hours later, I'm sitting in the parking lot. Where's that girl at? Anyway, don't tell her I said that. John, did you have some? Oh, over here.
You make more of things that aren't important.
Yes.
It was a mark. So,
And probably accomplished exactly what God wanted it to. Yeah, it was a big L. That's what it was. Will.
Whatever the mark was, I don't feel that it would have any bearing on us as Christians today. The people then who were able to see it and came across him knew it and would understand the significance of it, and it applied to them at that time during his life. But whether it was a scar, a discoloration of some sort, doesn't change how we ought to live and be as Christians today.
Yes. Now, we can also discuss the implications of this as well. If we involve ourselves in sin, well, how many kinds of sin are there where you can come away with scars? Quite a few. Quite a few. So, God is not afraid to put a mark on someone who involves themselves in sin. And I don't know for sure that that's a lesson we're supposed to come away with, but I can see that there. I can see the potential. And when I'm old enough to have talked to several people who've involved themselves in sin. Of course, I've never involved myself in any sin, so I don't have any scars. But the deeper the sin, the deeper the scar. And sometimes you'll never see the scars on the outside. Cain's was obvious. People could see that. That's what the purpose was, to show people, don't you harm this man because I've already judged him. But a lot of the scars we bear today are very internal, and nobody knows about them. And I don't want to imply by that every scar we bear is from God. Some of it's just sin. Just like what the law says. If you knock somebody's tooth out, what has to happen to you according to the law? You get your tooth out. Well, okay, you've got your tooth out. That's your scar because of your sin. But what about the guy whose tooth you knocked out? What did he sin to have that happen to him? Well, he didn't. You just knocked his tooth out. That was injustice. That's why you got to have your tooth knocked out. Eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. That's what the law said. Some people say that's barbaric, but the reality of that is that says everybody's even. Nobody's status gets them above the law. Whatever you do to somebody else, that's what's going to happen to you. How would things change, do you think, in America if that aspect of the law was instituted immediately? What's that? I think after a while we could shut down some of our prisons because people would be scared to death to do what they do. People say, and I'm getting off on a tangent here, people say that capital punishment is not a deterrent to crime, and I disagree with that vehemently. That's the thing about it. It's not capital punishment if it happens so far after the crime that 15 lawyers have become millionaires, and I'm not down on lawyers, but that's the way our system works, and nobody remembers the crime. What's this guy being? There was somebody in the news not long ago being put to death for a crime they did over 20 years ago. That was in the news. Yes, people are down there with posters. Hey, don't kill this guy. We know he killed 37 people, but anyway, don't get me started on that. You didn't get me started on that, did you? I got me started on that. It's this old Bible's fault. It's just full of stuff that provokes me. That's what it is. You read history, and it provokes you. There's a guy by the name of Rick Atkinson. He's a historian. He writes about World War II. He's got a trilogy of books from start to finish about Americans' involvement in the war, and I had to quit reading them because they made me angry. And all he was doing was reporting the facts. This is what happened. This is why this battle went this way. This is why that battle went this way. This is how the politicians did this that cost the lives of American soldiers. And that's what we're reading here, though. God's just given it to us fact-wise, bare bones facts. and sometimes it's about his people and his faithful ones. So Adam was well, we're really making time on this, aren't we? Adam was 130 when he became the father of Seth. Seth was how old when he became the father of Enosh? Okay, 35. Woo! 35 years old. Oh, 105. Oh, that's right. I'm thinking about chapter 11. I'm getting too far ahead of myself. 105. You know, that would be a good idea to become parents when you're over 100. Because then you would know something about raising kids. You just wouldn't remember where you put them. Seth was 105 when he became the father of Enosh. Enosh was 90 when he became the father of Kenan. Kenan was 70. All right, you're doing it. Hey, I thought this was going to be tedious. And you go, oh, why are you making us find all these numbers? But they're right there. Kenan was 70 when he became the father of Mahalalel. Mahalalel was 65. Jared was 162. Enoch, 65. We going too fast? Methuselah. Okay. Lamech. So whose son was Lamech? Or whose dad was Lamech? He's Noah's dad. Noah was blank when he became the father of Shem. 500. Now that's interesting the way it says it. I don't know if those boys were triplets or what, but it just says he was 500 years old when he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem was mentioned first, so if they weren't triplets, Shem was almost certainly the firstborn. At any rate, that's the number we're given. So from Adam to Shem's birth, there were how many years? 1,556. You can trust Chuck's math. Or did Laura do that? Because she's the bookkeeper. He did, okay. Oh, he's the mathematician. Chapter 11. Shem was how old? He was 100 when he had Arpachshad, and I'm taking a guess at the pronunciation. Arpachshad is not here to correct me. Arpachshad was how old? 35. There's where I got the 35. Shelah was 30 when he had Eber, or when his wife had Eber. Eber was 34 when Peleg was born. Peleg was 30 when he had Reu. Reu was 32. Serug was 30. Nahor was 29. Terah was 70. So from Shem to Abram's birth, there were 390 years. Incidentally, I'll just throw this in here. When you get to Genesis 7:6, it says that the flood came in Noah's 600th year. Now, if you take Noah's age at that time, 600, take 600, and then you back up to his dad, Lamech, and you add to that 600, 182, and then you back up to Lamech's dad, Methuselah, and you add 187. What do you get? You get 969 years. Does that number ring a bell? That's how old Methuselah was. So when did Methuselah die? He left this world in the year of the flood. Did he die in the flood? There's all kinds of room for speculation there. Could God have put him on the ark? I suppose if he was righteous, God could have, but that's not how it worked out. I just find it interesting when we read about Methuselah, we think that's the oldest guy in the Bible. But there's a possibility he might have lived even longer than 969 years had it not been for the flood. Don't know that, but it's just something to consider. And this to me illustrates so many truths that are in the scriptures But if you don't take some time to work with what information is given you, you'll never really discover it. Because the Bible doesn't come right out and say, oh yeah, Methuselah died during the year of the flood. Doesn't say that. You just got to kind of figure that out for yourself. There's a lot of things in the Bible like that just need to be figured out. And they're worth figuring out. All right, back page. Continuing from Abram. Abram, how old was he when he had Isaac? He was 100. Isaac was 60. This is what it says in 25:21 to 26. When he had Jacob. What will Jacob's name be changed to? Be changed to Israel. He wrestles with the angel, and the angel says, okay, you're not going to be Jacob anymore, you're going to be Israel. Now Jacob was 130 when he and his family moved to Egypt, and that's from chapter 47, verses 27 to 28. And so all these numbers are here to provide the information we need to know how many years. And the divine lineage to Jesus is going to continue through whom? Through which boy? Through Judah. Not through Joseph, but through Judah. But it's in the history of Joseph that we get the number of years. And the children of Israel were in Egypt for how long? 400 years. So, backing up from Adam to Shem, we've got 1,556 years. From Shem to Abraham, we've got the 390 years. And then from Abram to the Exodus, we've got 560 years. A grand total, if you add them up, 2,506 years to the Exodus from creation, which took place around 1500 BC. That's the last blank to fill in. I think I redid the last part. What does the last part say? The last part says, yes. So did you do the math? How many years from the time given for Jesus' birth back to the creation? Anybody get 4,006? Chuck? Still working, all right. Soon it'll be tax season, and then, well, got to add a lot of numbers in. 4,006 years. What's the world say about that? Yeah, that's crazy. That's ridiculous. 4,006 years. The world is billions of years old. And how long has humanity been around? 300,000 years as we are now, 3 million years if you count our primate ancestors, quote unquote. Yeah, I know. That's laughable too. Is there any evidence, physical, scientifically verifiable evidence, that the earth is not as old as billions of years? Yes, there is. There's plenty of it. All you got to do is look for it with the right people. It absolutely is. Look up mitochondrial DNA. And not all of this is well known. Not all of it's made the news because, well, there's a passage in Romans where Paul talks about the truth being suppressed by unrighteousness. And I believe this is what's happening in the world of apologetics that shows that the earth is not as old as we're being told. Some apologists have conjectured, scientists who are also apologists, conjecture that about 90% of the evidence points to a young earth, but what we're being fed is the 10% that supplies the political agenda of those who don't want there to be any God. If you look at things like river deltas all over the world, river deltas have sediment flowing out of them at a certain rate, and when you extrapolate that backwards, You go back to about the time of the flood, which makes perfect sense. After the flood, when the waters would have been subsiding and rivers been forming on the new surface of the earth, then they would have been dumping sediment out at the mouth of those rivers into the oceans that it was. And when you measure those sediments, they're consistent across the globe, and they all go back to about 4,000 years. When you look at the salinity of the ocean, I never would have thought of this, but scientists have. You look at the salinity of the ocean, they say, you know, if the world's that old, sea ought to be a lot more salty, but it's not. It's just got a certain amount of salt in it. You look at the gases in the atmosphere, they measure the gases, and they say, well, why do we still have this gas? Because if this gas is being depleted into the layers above, why do we still have these gases? Human existence, if we've been around for 300,000 years, there ought to be a lot more evidence to be found archaeologically and paleontologically, where you're digging up bones. That was a thing before Randy Travis came along. You know, he sang that song, Digging Up Bones. Well, that's what paleontologists do. So there is plenty of evidence to show that the earth is much younger than we are often told. Also, there's evidence for the flood. I didn't put any of this in the worksheet, but when you look at the surface of the globe as it is, there's about 2 miles of strata that is waterborne sediment, generally speaking, over the surface of the earth. That's a lot of waterborne sediment. What in the world could cause so much of the surface of the earth to be covered by waterborne sediment other than a worldwide flood? And what do we find in that sediment? We find the remains of living beings and creatures that existed prehistorically, we say, although I don't know that there is any prehistory. When God starts out in the beginning, I created the heavens and the earth, there's not much history that comes before that. So prehistory is a concept that the Bible really disagrees with. You look in those sedimentary layers and you find all kinds of remains of animals. And how did they get there if those layers started out as rock? They didn't start out as rock. They started out as sediment that was borne by water. And a lot of those remains, almost all of them really, go through several layers of that sediment. So if each layer was taking millions of years to be laid down, or even 10 or 20 years to be laid down, the remains of those living beings would not be there. Their remains would have been decomposed and scattered. I remember,
Continents also connected at one time?
Yes. It was one main continent they think existed. They call it Pangaea. And probably at the time of the flood, that whole thing split up and moved across the surface of the earth. And that's another area where God gives us some detail. He says the fountains of the deep burst forth. Whether those fountains were water fountains or lava fountains, he's not specific. But all of these things came together based on God's power and according to God's power to somehow cover the surface of the earth with water to a depth of about 21 feet. The mountains we have now are probably not the mountains that existed then. And there's a passage in the Psalms that talks about the valleys rising up and the mountains lowering down, and that may be exactly how God did it. He could do that if he wanted to. If he spoke everything into existence, it's not a problem for him to flood the whole earth by lowering the land and raising the water level and causing volcanic eruptions everywhere. At any rate, one of the things you'll notice about these ages, at least the ones for the genealogies, if you look at chapter 5, you notice that what's the lowest age of any of these men in the genealogy having a son? Lowest age is 65. What's the highest age? Well, Noah's would be the highest at 500, but then there's also Lamech, 182, Methuselah, 187, Adam, 130. But then you get down to chapter 11. Shem, of course, he was of Noah's family. He was 100 when he had his boy, and that was, by the way, you'll notice in the text it says 2 years after the flood. So 2 years after the flood, he gave birth to a son. That was Arpachshad. But then, what's the highest age after that? You got to go all the way down to Terah, who was 70 when he had Abram. But prior to that, it's 35, 30, 34, 30. Another thing you'll notice that we haven't pointed out in this worksheet is that people's ages dropped. after the flood. People weren't living as long. Why is that? I don't know. One more verse, Lord. There's a lot of speculation that prior to the flood, there was a canopy, the waters above the earth and the waters below the earth. Maybe when the scriptures speak of waters above the earth, there was a vapor canopy above us that protected everything on the earth from the harmful UV rays, ultraviolet rays that the sun brings down now, and also created, what do you call it when you've got plants growing? What kind of a house? A hothouse environment where everything was tropical, whole world was tropical. So it might have been like that. What about the size of the animals that we find buried in the ground? Even the animals we know today, bears, beavers. Beavers used to be as big as bears. So if men lived long ages, perhaps animals lived long ages as well. Reptiles, for example, as long as a reptile lives, what does it do? It grows. It continues to gain in size. So maybe that is one explanation for the dinosaurs. Just reptiles that continued to grow and got bigger and bigger and bigger until God wiped them out with the flood. At any rate, you look at all these things and you think about it, all of it really makes good sense. So why people started living less, I don't know. But the way things are going, I don't know if I want to live much longer. I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm just saying, wow, this earth is a mess. And the more I see the picture that God gives us of being with Him, away from all this, the only thing keeping me from wanting to go right now is my family and hunting and fishing. So anyway, I'm talking to people who understand what I'm talking about, I know. So, any questions about any of this? Any comments or observations to make? Boy, that's pretty good timing right there. Nice job, Hal. Hit that button. All right. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to go back and we're going to talk to some degree about Noah. We haven't gotten specific about him or his family or all the things relating to him besides just what we talked about here regarding the flood. But we'll talk about him and move from there. If there's anything in this class that you want to cover from Genesis, don't be afraid to write it on a piece of paper and hand it to me. If you tell me, I'll forget it. I might even lose a piece of paper you give me, but I'm much more likely to hold on to it if you write it down and give it to me on a piece of paper. All right, anybody got anything? All right, bless your hearts. We're dismissed.